This is a true story. A story of survival, of struggle, and of a deadly outbreak that nearly brought an entire community in Northern Labrador to its knees. My father, Raymond Zinck, was a young RCMP Mountie stationed in Hopedale, Labrador from 1953 to 1957. In those years, he witnessed firsthand the challenges of life in the remote north, the bitter cold, the unforgiving landscape, and the unbreakable spirit of the people who called it home. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. A silent killer swept through the town, not targeting people, but the very animals that made survival possible. This is his story in his words. It was a quiet morning at the detachment in Hopedale, Labrador. The kind of morning where the cold wind hums through the cracks in the old buildings, and the ice stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The locals were preparing for the coming spring, anticipating the great thaw that would soon loosen winter's grip. I don't recall the exact year, but this occurred during the 1950s. Just before noon, John Gear stepped inside. His face was weathered, his expression was serious. He had been out on the harbor ice, cutting free the mooring for his boat, trying to sink it with rocks before the ice breakup could drag it out to sea. But that wasn't what brought him to me. He had seen something very strange. A red fox, just feet away from him, which in itself may not sound that strange, but there was something wrong. Its face, its mouth, were covered in porcupine quills. And John tried to scare it off and even ran at it with an axe, yelling and waving his arms. But the fox didn't behave like it normally would. Instead of fleeing, it just moved a short distance before stopping, again and again. It just refused to leave and didn't seem to be afraid of John. Something was definitely wrong. John told me where he had last seen the fox. I knew I had to act fast, so I grabbed my revolver, strapped on my snowshoes, and set off to track the animal. Its paw prints were fresh in the snow, weaving through the ice and the village outskirts. I followed them for hours, but the fox was elusive. It wasn't until I neared the village that I caught my first glimpse of it. And that's when all hell broke loose. One of Tom Edmonds' dogs spotted the fox and attacked it. But instead of running away, the fox attacked the attacking dog. In Hopedale, it was common for female dogs with pups to just roam free, to protect the pups from other dogs that might break loose. But this fight was brutal. The fox, despite its smaller size and obvious suffering with the porcupine quills in its face, held its own and attacked viciously. I had my revolver out. I could have taken a shot, but I hesitated. There was just too much movement, too much risk of shooting Tom's dog. The fight raged on, but somehow the fox broke free and escaping onto the ice before I could shoot at it. And that's when it attacked a second dog. I raised my revolver and fired once, then twice, and I missed both times. By now, people were coming out of their homes, drawn by the commotion, the barking, and the gunfire. I shouted for someone to get a rifle. This fox wasn't normal. It was obviously sick. I thought it might be rabies, but didn't know anything about rabies, and I knew even less about distemper. I didn't know what was wrong. Then the fox encountered and engaged its third and final opponent. Several men now had their rifles, and I saw Muncie Piogi kneel down, steady his aim. I knew the lab would need the brain to determine the issue, so I yelled out to him, "Shoot it in the body! Shoot it in the body!" A shot rang out, and the fox stumbled, and then it collapsed onto the ice. Finally, it was dead, unfortunately, from a perfectly placed headshot. Nonetheless, when we got the carcass, I saw the porcupine quills still embedded in its face and mouth. The pain it must have been in must have been unbearable, but it still attacked those other dogs. My concern was bigger than just this fox. If it had rabies or something, we had a serious problem on our hands. I immediately sent a telegram to headquarters in St. John's. Their response came several days later. Send the carcass to Goose Bay for testing immediately. We had frozen the fox's body, and it sat in storage for nearly 10 days before a plane could arrive and take it. Weeks had passed before we finally received the results. It wasn't rabies, it was distemper. And because it took so long to get word back, by now it was definitely too late. The disease spread rapidly. Dogs that had fought the fox were now attacking others in the village, spreading the infection like wildfire. Soon more dogs fell ill, becoming aggressive, uncharacteristically violent, and then started dying off. We received word that anti-distemper serum was on its way, but it just wasn't fast enough. By the time the serum arrived, the village had already lost most of its working dogs. We did our best to vaccinate the survivors, but some locals refused to have them vaccinated. They were convinced the vaccine itself was killing the dogs. We thought maybe we were administering it wrong. The instructions were that the inoculations were to be given subcutaneous, a word really not in my vocabulary. Reverend Grubb, the Moravian missionary, told us that this meant under the skin, which was what we'd been doing all along. But the reality was the dogs were already infected with distemper, and that's what killed them, not the vaccine. We were losing this battle badly. Out of the 500 to 600 working dogs in Hopedale, only 53 survived. These dogs mean survival itself. Without them, how would people get to hunt, to feed their families, and travel? It was a disaster. Some locals were fortunate enough to be in their winter homes miles away when this happened, so their animals were spared. But for those left behind, they paid the price. After inoculating all the Hopedale dogs, we went to Davis Inlet and inoculated the dogs there with what vaccine we had left, even though the dogs in Davis Inlet were unaffected at this point. It was very difficult to carry out our routine patrols because of the limited number of dogs in the village. We normally visited and checked up on people residing in their wintering camps in the various bays. I decided to make a patrol to, and I know I'm going to butcher this, Kanarakoq Bay to visit John and Hilda Dickers. The trip was about 80 to 100 miles one way, which would take 2 to 3 days by dog team. I hired my friend Jim Gear and his dogs for the trip. Jim usually had 20 to 24 dogs, but all but 2 had died from the distemper, so he borrowed 4 dogs from his brother to go along with his 2 remaining dogs. On our second day out, we decided to head for a summer fishing place owned by William Abel from Hopedale. We arrived late in the evening, and I began making a seal meat stew for our evening meal. Jim prepared the dogs for the night, staking them apart so they couldn't fight. And then all of a sudden, a gunshot rang out. I ran outside. Jim stood there with his rifle in his hand. one of the dogs lay dead at his feet. The dog had attacked him. Jim believed that the husky had distemper. I wasn't so sure. They told me that distemper didn't usually make dogs aggressive. That was more of a symptom of rabies. But we had seen something completely different in this outbreak of distemper. There was something more vicious, more violent. I don't know, maybe it wasn't the disease itself. Maybe it was the suffering that came with it that made the dogs more aggressive. But it was our experience, the dogs were definitely more aggressive. While we stayed at the Williams camp, I noticed something unusual on a windowsill. A homemade barometer. Just 2 glass bottles, one inverted into the other filled with kerosene. Jim explained to me without hesitation, when the weather's good, the liquid rises. When a storm's coming, it drops. It was a simple tool, ingenious really, a lifeline in a place where the weather dictated mere survival. And yet, as I stood there watching the liquid shift in the bottle's neck, I couldn't help but ponder the storm we had just encountered that took nearly every dog from Hopedale. If only we could have gotten the results back in the serum sooner, we could have saved more dogs and avoided this nightmare of a catastrophe. As we traveled to John and Hilda Dicker's home, the weight of the outbreak hung heavy on my mind. We spent several enjoyable days with them, and John showed me how to set nets under the ice for fish. It was an amazing experience. I learned a lot. When we first arrived there, though, John met us at the door, his face lined with concern. His first words weren't of welcome, but of warning. He didn't want our dogs anywhere near his dogs. He knew what was happening back in Hopedale. He had heard about the sickness and about the deaths, and he was determined to keep his dogs safe. Distemper was relentless. It spreads like wildfire through the air, through contact. It could even spread by the soles of our boots. I understood his fear. We staked our dogs far from his team, isolating them as much as possible. But still, John wasn't satisfied. So every evening, without fail, he went to each of his dogs one by one and carefully washed their noses with disinfectant. I wasn't convinced that that would help, but John didn't care about my theories or my doubts. He was willing to do anything to protect his animals. And the most incredible thing? While distemper cut through the dogs of Hopedale like a hot knife through butter, leaving only a handful alive, John's dogs never got sick. Not one of them. The loss of nearly 600 working dogs was devastating, a blow that shook the very foundation of life in Hopedale. These dogs were more than just animals. They were transportation, lifelines, and survival itself. Without them, travel was crippled, hunting was disrupted, and the daily struggles of life in the north became even harsher. But if there's one thing about the people of Hopedale, it's their resilience. They didn't give in to despair. They rallied together, shared what they had, and found ways to keep moving forward. Those with surviving dogs lent them to others, taking turns making vital hunting runs. Families pulled together, adapting however they could. The loss was great, but the strength of the people of Hopedale was greater. In the face of this hardship, they did what they had always done for generations: stood together and endured. Besides the actual photos, the images featured in this video were created using the DALL-E AI image generation tool. They are artistic representations and do not accurately reflect the RCMP uniform or other details of the 1960s era. These visuals are intended for illustrative or creative purposes only and should not be interpreted as historically or culturally accurate depictions. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed that video. Check out the details below in the description. There's lots of information in there. And please leave me a comment. Leave me your thoughts. Love to hear from you guys. I always try to reply to everybody's comments. As well, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on the bell to get the notifications when a new video has been uploaded. As well, if you like this video, you'll find more just like it right here. And don't forget to head over to my website by clicking right there. Thanks for watching.